on an individual 2-year fellowship with us at the Institute for Comparative Federalism at URAC Research. And the acronym DATE stands for Diversity Accommodation Through Territorial Equalization. And the project was awarded the Seal of Excellence and then funded by the Autonomous Province of Bolzano-Bozen. Now, before we go in medias res, I'd like to explain some, let's say, rules of today, especially to the participants. We'll start with an introduction by Carlo, who will tell us a bit more about the motivation of his book and give us some insight into the topic. The second speaker will be Maja Sahadzic, who will share her, let's say, impressions on the book and then on the topic in general. And the third speaker, before moving to the Q&A and discussion, is Francisco Javier. He will close the circle of speakers and give his thoughts on the topic as well. We'll have the Q&A afterwards, so after the 3 presentations, but it's important for you to know that you can put your questions in the Q&A section already during the presentations. You can just submit them in writing. This way, we're sure that we'll not lose some, let's say, burning questions and forget them. So I guess this is enough of service messages from my side. And we can finally come to the subject of today's event, which is the book, The Symbolic State, Minority Recognition, Majority Backlash, and Secession in Multinational Countries, authored by Carlo Basta and published with McGill Queen's University Press. I think it was the end of last year, so 21. Now, the participants are probably all familiar with Carlo Basta, but let me just nevertheless list some, let's say, milestones of his career. He's a lecturer in politics and co-director of the Center on Constitutional Change at the University of Edinburgh. And previously, he was associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada. And while at Memorial, he held visiting positions at Pompeu Fabra University, the Institute for Self-Government Studies in Barcelona, the University of Barcelona, the Center on Constitutional Change in Edinburgh. And in 2016, he was selected as Federal Scholar in Residence at our Institute for Comparative Federalism in URAC Research. And in this anniversary year of the Federal Scholar in Residence program, because it's actually the 10th year of this program, it is a special honor for us to welcome you, Carlo, at least virtually. So with this warm welcome back at URAC, Carlo, I hand over to you and the floor is yours. You have 25 minutes. Oh, by the way, I read on Twitter that this is already the 11th edition of book presentation for you. So I hope that your enthusiasm is just going up and not going down, and that your interest in this research stuff is still increasing.
Still very, very enthusiastic, Petra. Thank you very much for a very warm introduction and welcome. And I do have to, I want to mention just parenthetically that I remember my visit to URAC very, very fondly, the 2016 visit that you mentioned, very, very fondly, in fact, and I can't believe that it's been as long as it has been so far. So I'm very much also looking forward to getting back to URAC, which is going to happen in a couple of weeks. So yeah, just very briefly, my thanks to both you and Francisco Javier, obviously, for the Institute for Comparative Federalism and URAC for hosting this, and of course to Maja Sahadzic for agreeing to join us and to comment on the book. Clearly, also to our audience, as you said, who I can't see, but I've seen a couple of very familiar names. So I'm looking forward to the proceedings. So without much ado, I want to get into it. As you said, in medias res, I'm going to share the screen. And please do tell me if this does not actually work. So can you see it? Yeah. Okay.
It's working.
So look. This, in one way, this book is fairly conventional in the sense that it covers some fairly well-trodden set of themes, including, basically it looks at institutions in 4 multinational states and how attempts to accommodate minority nations through institutions of territorial autonomy may or may not lead to secessionist crises. So in that sense, I think it's conventional because of its thematic reach. But I also think it's let's say slightly unusual and perhaps a little bit odd in that particular context, and this is why I believe it should be read, because the focus here is not on what institutions do, right? So what institutions of territorial autonomy, or more broadly, or more specifically, if you wish, the institutions of federalism, how they, let's say, privilege certain political projects at the expense of others, or how they protect or fail to protect either collective or individual interests. Rather, the concern of the book is, or the focus of the book is on what institutions mean. So the book really argues that institutions are themselves symbols, and it foregrounds the political importance of this symbolic dimension of institutions in 4 multinational states. And these 4 states are Spain, Canada, former Yugoslavia, and former Czechoslovakia. So now, before I get to the core of the book's argument, I feel obliged to tell you, first of all, how I got to those specific 4 cases, and to that symbolic institutional theme that the book ended up being built around. So the book itself started as a doctoral project at the University of Toronto, a little too long ago for comfort, as far as I'm concerned, at least. And the question that motivated it was, in hindsight, I would say reasonably unambitious, which is why central governments in some multinational states were more willing than their counterparts in other multinational states to extend greater fiscal or economic autonomy for minority regions, right? And so the argument that I developed in response to that question, as I was developing my doctoral dissertation, was that this kind of variation in the willingness of central governments to do so depends on the alignment of broad political economy strategies between the 2 sets of governments. That is to say, the central government and then the claimant government, or the regional government that was asking for greater fiscal autonomy or greater economic autonomy more broadly. And so my argument, broadly speaking, was, and it's represented in this particular fairly straightforward 4x4 matrix, was that to the extent to which there is alignment between the 2 sets of governments, there's going to be a higher likelihood of accommodation of these kinds of demands, and where the 2 sets of governments clash on political economy strategies, that the accommodation is going to be less far reaching. So I came up with this, obviously oversimplified division into 2 sets of political economy strategies, pro-market and statist. And I want to emphasize that here, what I'm talking about are tendencies rather than absolutes, and that I'm emphasizing specifically a relative orientation of the 2 sets of governments. So it's not necessarily, this kind of fixed benchmark of how market-prone a particular level of government is relative to other in the same level of government, but rather how pro-market or statist a government is, let's say a central government is, relative to its regional counterpart in the same country, right? So just to kind of formalize it or carry it further, what I just said is basically this, which is where if you have 2 sets of governments that are fairly aligned on either pro-market or statist strategy, that we should expect that the central government is going to be more likely to grant greater resources or control over fiscal resources to the claimant government than in these instances where there is a clash between the two sets of governments. And this necessitated at least 4 cases, or 4 case studies, which is how I landed on the 4 cases or 4 countries that I mentioned to you just a second ago. So on this sort of alignment of pro-market strategies, I looked at Spain and Catalonia from about 1980. Really, it's actually from about 1982. So not entirely ironically, it was really the first PSOE, or the socialist government, in 1982 that implemented a fairly far-reaching market-oriented strategy of governance, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. And then I have, as an add-on here, Socialist Yugoslavia from 1964 onwards, and again, we can talk a little bit more about that, but just very briefly, in and about 1964-65, the federal government of Yugoslavia took a fairly sharp pro-market turn, even in the context of of what was called self-managed socialism, and that kind of policy orientation endured at least until 1972 outright, and then there were elements of that strategy that endured beyond 1972. The second case, where I look at the statist claimant government and pro-market central government, is Czechoslovakia in the last 3 years of the country's existence. The third one, and that's the one that I started with, which was this kind of a clashing kind of combination of pro-market minority governments and statist central government, was really Yugoslavia with Croatia, not only with Croatia, but specifically with Croatia from about 1958 to about 1964. And then finally, Canada with Quebec from about 1960 to about 1984, on the assumption that both, or observation that both governments, both the central government and the government of Quebec, were committed to the expansion of the role of the state in society and economy. And so what I ended up doing was looked at these 4 cases through time and try to figure out if those hypotheses actually hold any water, if they really make any sense. So very, very briefly, what I'm about to show you kind of goes against most of the recommendations I give to my students in terms of the kinds of presentations they ought to have, which is to say I have too much text in it, but bear with me. It is the following. This is the story of the findings. The first column is the cases themselves. The second concerns the core types of demands that were articulated by the regional governments. So you can see those from Quebec, Catalonia, all the way down to Slovakia. What the expected outcome would be in line with the 2x2 matrix that you just saw previously, and then whether the expectation actually held. And then with a little bit of detail at the very far end over there. So broadly speaking, and this is the story of the dissertation, but it's also the story of the first part of the book, the political economy story of the book, is that the expectations were largely confirmed, although I'm not entirely convinced by that particular explanation. But at any rate, that's not the main story of the book, right? So the main reason that I just sort of elaborated all of this is so that it hopefully makes sense why it is that I landed on these particular 4 cases. But as I was finishing the dissertation, I felt pretty unhappy with how that dissertation was progressing. I felt unhappy with the range and the reach of the question. I thought that the dissertation didn't provide answers to some of the bigger questions that I really had, right? So it doesn't, that political economy part of the story doesn't really explain why it is that some minority nationalist movements end up unhappy with quite far-reaching autonomy, fiscal or otherwise, and then continue pursuing sort of greater concessions. Why it is that some of those kinds of political clashes, political conflicts erupt into full-on secessionist crises, and what is the role of institutions or territorial autonomy more specifically in these crises, right? So this political economy story, I felt, did not really help me kind of answer these questions. So I was unhappy, as were some of the people in the dissertation defense were asking me, well, what does this tell us about what we ultimately want to know, right? And so in order to answer these questions, I felt that I needed to broaden the analytical lens. And over time, I realized that I also needed to rethink the way in which I myself thought of institutions, right? Not only what they do, but what they actually are. And ultimately, I settled on the story about the symbolic aspects of institutions, which is the core kind of a part of the argument of the book, to which I turn now, right? So that's the symbolic politics part of the story. And the story is more or less as follows, right? So I'm taking you back to the beginning, right? And I needed to kind of re-examine some of the assumptions about what multinational states are, what institutions in those states are, what they do, what their function is. So my starting point for the symbolic politics part of this story is that when representatives of minority nations make a claim for enhanced or more comprehensive self-government, that they're actually doing 2 things, right? The first is that they are asking for more autonomy and resources in order to get things done, right? So, and these I label instrumental demands. So they are asking for, resources so they can achieve faster economic development or protect their culture, or more cynically, the political elites are seeking to protect their own political position, perhaps allowing them to, to build their patronage networks, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So that is an important part of that of those claims. But those claims are also very, very profoundly symbolic, right? So asking for enhanced self-government in these particular cases is also a demand for recognition, in the sense that these the representatives or purported representatives of these communities wish to be recognized, wish for their communities to be recognized as nations in their own right. And I think as importantly, they wish for the central government to recognize that the state, the overall multinational, the state as such is not a nation state of an undifferentiated single political community, but rather that it is a multinational or plurinational state. And so this is the symbolic aspect of these minority demands. Now, the recognition of these demands can take a variety of forms, right? It can include formal organization of the state. So in some cases, these demands are for greater asymmetry, right? So for instance, in Spain and Canada, therefore, the asymmetry is there in order to recognize that Quebec or Catalonia or the Basque Country are actually not the same as the other territorial units. In other cases, the demand is for symmetry, for formal symmetry. So for example, in Czechoslovakia, prior to 1968, the Slovaks felt that it was the asymmetry of institutions that was misrecognizing their identity. And in the UK, it's quite similar. If you look at the policy documents of the Labour Party of Wales, what they're asking for is greater symmetry. What they're basically asking for is that England too should have a set of institutions so that there's this kind of equality of nations, and so that the central government is not really de facto the government of England, and then you have these kind of devolved add-ons. So that's one form of recognition through formal organizations of the states. Of the state itself, but there's also recognition via constitutional stamping, right? The revision of constitutions or quasi-constitutional documents to include explicit recognition of countries' multinationality or the national status of the claimant group. Now, whether these demands are accommodated or not, what we're dealing with here is not an event, right, a one-time thing that happens, but rather a process that unfolds over many years in some cases, and in fact, in all of these cases, it took quite a few years. So the methodology that I deployed to try to figure out whether this actually makes sense had to be sensitive to that fact, which is why I developed a process-based account or explanation of the link between accommodation on one hand, or lack thereof, and secessionist crises in the four cases that I cover here. So the causal story is as follows, right? So I look at this as a kind of extended process, and the following, what is about to follow, is a set of hypotheses that I derive from that. Oops, sorry. So I look at this process as a two-stage kind of, process, right? So at the very outset, let's say you have a qualitatively different demand in Quebec 1960, in Catalonia 1978 with constitutional reforms, and so on and so forth. And so the demand, as I just articulated, is one for both greater instrumental levers of power, in this specific case, fiscal autonomy, but not only fiscal autonomy, and for recognition. And in this first round, there's a tendency on behalf of the central government, and this is assuming that there is that alignment that I talked about on political economy from the first part of the story, that the first round of response by the central government basically does go quite far in extending on the instrumental side of things, but that recognition remains relatively, this explicit formal recognition remains relatively limited. So what this does to the politics of the minority region is sort of ambiguous, right? So on one hand, it shows to at least a good chunk of the population, well, we got some concessions, perhaps we could get more. So on one hand, it actually strengthens the autonomists, the people who believe that, the region should continue as part of the country, but that they should continue pressing for more powers, but also for greater recognition. But on the other hand, there's also a part of the political spectrum that is unhappy with what has just happened. And this is the more kind of radical part, the secessionists, who are basically saying, look, this is as far as this is going to take us. Let's start demanding outright independence. So what happens as a consequence of this is that there's a kind of mobilization within the minority community and a re-articulation of the demands from that first round into round two. So basically, you have yet another round of demands that lend themselves yet again to this claim to both greater, let's say, fiscal autonomy and additional policy authority, but also recognition, some more far-reaching formal recognition of the state's multinationality and of the status of the claimant community. Now, in this second round, the central government can no longer afford to basically do the same thing that they did in the first round, right? Because the context has now changed. So the same kinds of concessions are no longer sufficient. Of course, this interacts with the political dynamics, and we can talk about that a little bit more. So party politics, obviously, especially in democratic settings, plays a role. So what I expect to see is that the second round of responses is going to actually combine the instrumental with the symbolic concessions, right? So there's going to be more kind of on the fiscal side, perhaps more autonomy on other policy issues, but that this is going to be combined with some reasonably far-reaching attempt to formally recognize the claimant community as some sort of either a distinct society, as it was the case in Quebec, or a nation, and either implicitly or explicitly recognizing that the state itself is actually, a multinational polity rather than a nation state in effect, no matter how internally differentiated the population actually is. And it's this response that I think is the critical juncture, is the critical part of this, because what it does is it creates the conditions for majority backlash. And the reason it does so is that for the first time, it basically throws the burden of identity adjustment away from the minority communities onto the majority community, because it's now the majority community has to reimagine the way they think of themselves and of, quote unquote, their state, right? So the tendency for majorities is to identify with the state overall. And in this particular instance, they're asked to rethink their idea of the state in the more multinational key. So this majority backlash that I'm talking about, basically, if it occurs, if there is open politicization, so in other words, political parties that openly start to articulate opposition to this kind of turn towards symbolic reconfiguration of the state in the multinational key, right? And if this actually does happen, it has three combined political consequences. The first one is that it demonstrates without much ambiguity to the minority population that there is at least a substantial proportion of the majority population that is simply unwilling or unable to reimagine the state in this multinational key. The second consequence is that this backlash increases the likelihood that any concessions that were extended in that response too are going to be either rescinded or reversed. And as a consequence of that, this is the third kind of effect of the majority backlash, is that this actually strengthens the position of radicals inside a minority nation and sidelines or marginalizes the moderates within it, and thus resulting in a secessionist process, right? So that's broadly speaking, that's the story. And what I want to show you now, just like I did with the first one, is what my findings are in terms of the four cases that I'm considering here, right? So the CPO stands for Causal Process Observation, which is a term of trade in process tracing in political science and somewhat in sociology as well, but basically it's observations, right? So what I did was I was scouring the record. I was trying to figure out whether I can find something that this confirms. So it's really the process of this confirmation, but I want to go very, very briefly over the findings in the four countries that I study here. So this is a kind of a static representation. These expected findings here are the static representation of what you just saw represented in a more dynamic kind of flowchart form. So the first bit is the expectation that if there is no symbolic concession, even if there is substantial instrumental concessions, that there is not going to be politicized majority backlash. And where there are symbolic concessions that are combined with instrumental ones that there should be majority backlash. So this is what I, in fact, see in Canada, Spain, and Yugoslavia in rounds 1 and round 2, respectively. Where there is no majority backlash, there ought not to be secessionist crisis. That's the expectation as well. And where there is majority backlash, the expectation is, well, there ought to be a sort of increase in support for secession to close to or above 50% in the relevant minority region, and an attempt by the regional government to actually effect this separation from the country, either through a referendum or some other means. And so the observation here is as follows, right? So what I'm basically saying that in Czechoslovakia, there was no majority backlash and no secessionist crisis, which you might say, hang on a second, didn't Czechoslovakia break up? And of course, the answer is yes, it did. You're correct. However, this was not due to any sort of upsurge of secessionist sentiment in Slovakia. In fact, support for independence in Slovakia never exceeded 20% during this time period. The only political party that advocated independence for Slovakia won somewhere in the order of 10 to 12%, I think, in the last election in 1992. So the Czechoslovak breakup was in effect a consequence of an elite deal between Klaus and Mečiar, between the premiers of Czech Republic and Slovakia. And the last category is this notion that where there is majority backlash, that you do see a secessionist crisis, which is something that I observed in Canada, Spain, and Yugoslavia. In terms of outright disconfirming observations, I did not find any, which is not going to surprise you, but there are two that are ambiguous. And they belong in this symbolic, so the expectation is that if there is a symbolic concession, there's going to be a majority backlash. And if there's no majority backlash, there's not going to be secessionist crisis. So the first one deals with Czechoslovakia, right? There was, in fact, during this time period, 1990, 91, 92, there were periodic negotiations on constitutional reform of Czechoslovakia. And throughout these negotiations, the Czech elites, if you wish, majority elites, were surprisingly willing to go very, very far in symbolic recognition of Slovakia as the nation, as the state of the Slovak nation, formal recognition of Czechoslovak Republic as a multinational state. And in fact, they were completely sanguine about including the right to secession in any future constitution for the Czechoslovak Republic. So on one hand, you would assume that this is actually a disconfirmation, because in this case, you have symbolic concessions, but there's no majority backlash. However, the reason I'm interpreting this as an ambiguous observation is for the following reasons. The first is that this kind of acceptance of formal multinationality of Czechoslovakia was already there at the very least since 1968 among the Czech political elites. And the second reason is that there was an additional symbolic element. During these negotiations, the Slovak representatives were insisting that the new constitution for the democratic Czech and Slovak Republic should be represented as a result of a state treaty, that in the same moment as it was forming this new democratic multinational state would in effect very briefly, I suppose, establish independent Czech and Slovak states that are now joining into Czech and Slovak Republic. So this was a fairly, this was a new demand, and it was the demand that the Czech elites were consistently refuting and refusing to acknowledge. And one of the reasons, on the basis of the research that I found, was that they were very, very aware that had they gone in this direction, that this was probably going to be a political hot potato. So that's why I'm treating that particular aspect of the process in Czechoslovakia as an ambiguous causal process observation. And the last one relates to the Quebec referendum in 1980 and the election of the Parti Québécois in 1976, right? So my argument is that where there's no majority backlash, that there ought not to be a secessionist crisis. Well, you know, if I'm right, and if there was no majority backlash to any concessions granted to Quebec in the 1970s, then you might rightly ask, well, why is it then that there was a referendum on, on sovereignty association in Quebec in 1980, and why did it win the support of 40% of the population? Now, I could be kind of disingenuous and say, well, 40% is not close to 50, right? But I don't want to go there, because I do believe that that's it's subject to debates. Rather, I suggest the following, and this is why I'm thinking of this as an ambiguous outcome. The first is that the rise of Parti Québécois, its winning of power in 1976 was not on the back of this surge of support for independence, but rather because of internal political dynamics, the incredible unpopularity of the incumbent government, and the fact that the Parti Québécois itself softened both its ideological, because it was more radically left-wing party, so both its ideological discourse and its discourse on independence. So it emphasized the notion that if it was to have a referendum, it would not simply declare independence if it was successful, but rather would start and open negotiations. So that's the first reason that it's something of a ambiguous causal process observation. The second one is, note that I was talking about 1980 referendum as in Quebec as a referendum of sovereignty association. And this was this shibboleth that the Parti Québécois came up with because they understood just how unpopular outright independence was among Quebecers. So all the polls during the 1970s showed that outright independence did not receive more than about 20% of support among Quebecers. And sovereignty association, which was a far more kind of softer version of this, was the one that actually received 40% in 1980. But more to the point, this was a very, very different situation from early 1990s in the same province in Quebec, where support for independence outright actually reached close to 50%, and support for sovereignty association outstripped 60% in certain polls. Right? So that's basically the story of the findings here. Now I want to wrap up. I think let me see what time it is. I think I'm close, probably, yeah. So I want to wrap up basically by saying, why I think this book actually is important, stepping back a little bit, right? In other words, if you don't care about secession and, multinational states and all that kind of stuff, why should you read it, or should you read it, right? So I think the book does at least three things that make it worthwhile. The first is, it won't surprise you because I foregrounded that at the very beginning, is that it foregrounds, and this is against, I would say, again, much of the work in political science and sociology, not only about multinational states and nationalist conflict and ethnic conflict, but also more broadly, there's this tendency to see institutions through this instrumental prism, right? They do stuff. This is what they do, right? Whereas here, what I think I show fairly conclusively is that they're possibly more important for what they mean, especially when it comes to mobilizing great masses of the population, right? So for political elites themselves, the instrumental bits could be very, very important. But when it comes to mobilizing people, I think it's the symbolic, the meaning of the institutions, that's actually a critical part of the equation. The second part, and the second contribution, and I think there's been more of this recently, but a lot of the work on multinational states, a lot of the work on secession, especially the less recent stuff, has tended to kind of focus on what the minority nationalists do and their political demands, their political behavior in order to explain, let's say, instability in multinational states. And here I emphasize the extent to which we cannot understand these political dynamics in multinational states by only looking at the minority side of the ledger, that we have to look at this dialectical political process between the majorities and minorities and within each of the camps, obviously. And then the final one, at least for now, right, is that the standard kind of explanations of the influence of institutions of territorial autonomy in multinational states tend to be, at least implicitly, look at these institutions, right? So work on power sharing, work on federalism. Institutions are almost like these prefabricated pillars, right? And they're important because of the features that they bring. What I show, I think, in the book is that the way in which these institutions are devised, so the politics of actually putting them into place, is probably as important as their features, as their characteristics, in figuring out what the consequences of these institutions might be for stability, survivability, democratic inclusion of these. And on that note, I'm hoping it was less than 25 minutes, but thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Carlo. Thanks for the insightful introduction to the subject. And I think it really brought us in medias res, as you promised. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions and comments afterwards, but in the meantime, let's move to Maya. She's our second speaker, and she's professor and research fellow at the University of Antwerp, senior research fellow at the Law Institute in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She has been a visiting researcher at the University of Toronto, the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law, the International Law in Heidelberg, and the University of Hong Kong, the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and her research revolves around constitutional asymmetries, multi-level governance, dynamic legitimacy, dynamic stability, authoritarianism, post-systems, constitutional values and principles, fundamental rights, legal theory, and a lot more. She's a co-chair of the Committee on New Directions in Scholarship of the ICON-S, and it's the largest international learned society with members from all over the globe. And in 2018, she was awarded the ISCFS Ron Watts Award for the best article. And in that article, she wrote about the concept of constitutional asymmetries to contribute to the Middle East peace process. And just like Carlo, Maya was a visiting researcher at Europe Research some time ago. So it's a bit like a homecoming event just before the summer for us. And on this note, I hand over to you, Maya. It's about 15 minutes for you.
Thank you very much for the great introduction. What I'm going to do is that I'm just going to continue the presentation, the end of the presentation that Carlo outlined about so what about this book. I just love the book. There's not much that I can criticize about it, but I'm going to start with the style. The style that I describe, I don't even know how to translate it, but in Croatian, and Carlo will know, we say that the style is very drinkable, meaning it is easy to read. So you take the reader by the hand, and I loved it so much because although some parts were highly expert-based, however, some parts could have been easily read by a non-expert audience, and that is a virtue. And also the literature review that you did is just amazing. It is so extensive, it is so meticulous. The methodological outline was clearly set out with all of the explanations of your methodological choices and applied limitations and so on. What I liked a lot about the book is that you actually explain the central government responses to autonomy claims for demands for greater autonomy, as you call it, and you do it in two rounds. You do it in the round of early demands and then increased demands, and you also tackle the recognition by minority nations. And here, what you do great, at least in my opinion, and that is very important, you actually emphasize the importance of the effects on majority communities, which is admittedly rarely discussed or integrated into theoretical models today. So one of your missions actually in this book is to show that it is very difficult to understand minority claims without paying attention to what happens to the majority. And I think this is something that we had, this discussion is something that we had not long ago when Brexit happened. And we see this rarely, I believe, if ever, in federal studies. It is true that we are concerned about the accommodation of minority, or the minority communities, as you call them, but we often forget, if we ever remember, to address the impact on the majority or the majority communities. And the second thing that you do great is that you demonstrate how the responses to these demands, the specific patterns that you call them, how you call them, of institutional accommodation or non-accommodation, actually lead to secessionist crisis. And I like how you tell your story through a symbolic politics story and then a political economy story. And this symbolic politics story to me resembles to an analysis of a structural design of a multinational state, while this political economy story resembles to an attempt to analyze the fiscal design. And all in all, I understood it as a structural and fiscal test that you use to analyze the impact of those institutional and fiscal relations on internal balances or imbalances, which is actually the evaluation of stability of the system. And one more thing that is great about your book is that you normalize the existence of multinational states. You normalize the existence of multinationalism as a feature of the contemporary political reality. And you rightly assume, or you write, that we assume that states are mostly national, although we are aware as researchers that half of the world's population actually right now lives in systems with federal features, and the majority of those systems has been established as multinational states or multinational systems. And so this book actually shows us that we cannot understand the politics of multinational states with the analytical tools that are developed for nation states, sort of to say. And you also normalize the multinational states with all of their crises, and the crises are a normal feature of federal reality and political reality in general, I'd say. And this allows you to open the discussion beyond the conflict, beyond the conflict management. And talking about the conflict management, I think one important aspect in your book is that you argue that the conflict management literature mostly views institutions as instruments, and you gave us a layout right now, mostly. So, and you mentioned the tools for the achievement of various national goals, which are either political, physical protection, economic advancement, and so on. And these are mostly linked or directed towards the trust building tools, or as you call them, uncertainty reducing tools. And I would say this is related to the stability features in federal scholarship. So I have to admit that I'm somewhere here in this end, so I will take this criticism gracefully because it is definitely true. And so you focus on the importance of the symbolic and expressive aspects of institutions such as flags, anthems, nationhood, and monuments, and so on. But at the same time, I do understand that understanding of nationalist symbolism actually helps us understand how identities are constructed and why you contest the static understanding of institutions. Why you contest, for example, what you call excessively instrumental view of institutions, why you contest the overemphasized impact of institutions, and so on. However, your approach is still institution-centered. It is still institutional. So I was thinking, although processes or procedural aspects, for example, are also institutionalized, is there a role maybe for them in overcoming the impasse that you describe in your book, considering that they can be understood not only under power sharing, which you're also skeptical about, but also as an ability to do something? Because you also ask if we mean only power sharing, and plus you admittedly write that the territorial accommodation is a process rather than a one-off event. So my question or concern would be if there is an approach actually that is not linked to institutions, or do we have to do research through the institutions? And then there is a sub-argument, for example, that the work on institutional impact tends to focus on the way in which institutions and institutional change affects the political actions of minority communities. And here I would have expected at least a little bit of discussion, a little bit more discussion on the link between the political actions tied to political parties, political ideologies, and identity factors, because this seems to be linked to the symbolic politics story, or it could be even its underlining feature. And then you also argue that the symbolic dimension is not only expressive of the community's identity, that it also delineates the boundaries of that community. And I found it in several parts in your book. So I was wondering, because I was also reading the Yugoslav case that was really brilliant. So I was wondering, how do we relate maybe the fluid borders to this? Have you thought of that? Was that on your mind when you were doing the analysis? Because I think the Yugoslav case could be or is very important here. For example, the difference between the territorial and non-territorial borders is not in their hardness and softness. It is actually where the identity lies within them. And it is a fact that identities in Yugoslavia extended sometimes in some of the republics beyond the borders of its republics. I know that your case is about Croatia, but in Bosnia and Herzegovina, this has been clearly shown during the conflict, the latest conflict from 1992 to 1995, when Croats and Serbs not only reached out to the neighboring Croatia and Serbia to find historical, linguistic, ethnic, religious connection to their identity, but also political and economic support for their political agenda. So the fluid borders that existed beforehand actually enabled the identity differences to gain this trans-border momentum, simply because the fluid borders harbored the basis for multiple territorial loyalties. And they enabled connecting overlapping identities regardless of state borders. So in this sense, it seems that the territory obviously did not only absorb the physical boundaries, but it accumulated diverse features of identity belongings. And just one remark about methodology, which is not necessarily the question for you, but something for the discussion, because you also argue that even though the theory of multinational states is poorly understood, and that the research on the theory is limited, you're still not convinced that a theory of all multinational states across the time and space is still possible. And you give your reasons for this, and I understand them. And those reasons are about temporal, geographical differences, and so on. And the reasons imply that multinational federalism in different states are different under different circumstances, and they are so different that a convincing general theory is not necessarily possible. Your analysis are also very comprehensive, and I appreciate your process tracing tool as appropriate for identifying causal mechanisms. But you also write that we need to know more about what makes multinational states work. And somehow I believe, and I think that we can do this only by having a comprehensive approach. And so I managed to extract some possible quantitative and qualitative components or directions, whatever you want to call them, in terms of studies here. And I know that you're also skeptical when you write that the institutional change or the institutional adjustments are, or maybe should be more than just causal layers. at a given point in time, and so on. But we also learn a lot from your case studies, and you acknowledge the role of the institutional dynamics and the role of time in explaining crisis. So I could not help myself not asking, is quantitative analysis actually what we are missing? Is a quantitative approach covering a causal analysis over at a time something that we're missing in order to establish this theory, so we don't have to wander around, especially if firms killed researchers like you, for example? I'm not saying that you have to do it, but maybe some large project could do, to cover the dynamics among different regions during different time frames. So to some extent, it does seem a little bit reductionist, what you're saying, especially because quantitative analysis can be supported or substantiated with qualitative analysis to identify and explain important aspects of the phenomenon. And for example, you identify yourself the Yugoslavo-authoritarianism as a possible feature that differentiates the pattern of institutional development from other cases, which got me wondering whether this could have been a congruent feature, for example, of some quantitative analysis. And finally, this brings me back to your argument that we do not need a general theory. Okay, maybe we do not, but do we at least need a framework to work with? Thank you.
Thanks indeed, Maya. Interesting comments and feedback as always. And I saw Carlo already taking notes, so I'm sure you get some answers afterwards. So without stealing time from the Q&A session that will follow, let me introduce the third and final speaker of today, Francisco Javier Romero, who is also my colleague and who's actually sitting in the office next door. And just before, he told me that he met actually Maya at the winter school at Europe Research. So speaking of homecoming, Francisco Javier is currently a researcher at the Institute for Comparative Federalism with the before mentioned DATE project that deals with the role of equalization mechanisms as tools of integration in multi-level countries that have experienced secessionist challenges. And he has been a visiting researcher at the University of Ottawa, the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, the Center for Political and Constitutional Studies in Madrid, and his research interests encompass the territorial distribution of powers in multinational systems with a special focus on federal states and the territorial integration of national minorities in secessionist contexts. He's also winner of the 17th Manuel Jiménez Abad Award for his book on the Canadian federal system and the integration of Quebec. So over to you, Francisco Javier.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Carlo and Maya for kindly accepting our invitation to take part in this webinar, and also, of course, to my colleague Petra Malfartaina for not only moderating this event, but also for co-organizing it together with me. So I will, after what Maya said, I feel I don't have many things to say, because I also very much enjoyed the book. It was also very easy to read and very interesting, in particular the insights that Carlo gave us about the different case studies. But I will try to structure my presentation into two parts. In the first one, I will briefly address some of the theoretical work of the book, and then I will make some comments on some of the cases. And first, I think that the idea to open this new subfield of research on comparative multinational states deserves recognition. I think this is a very interesting point, and it's a field of work that deserves further exploration, because we are used to this comparison of traditional federal states in a broad sense, if we would say. But it's important to focus on multinational states, and especially one thing that I think the book perfectly does, to focus not only on the minority or the minorities, as it was the traditional case, but also on the reaction of the majority, because the reaction of the majority most of the time explains the decisions of the majority about how to accommodate the minority. Then, second, I very much like the political economy story. I think this is such an important factor when dealing with the territorial accommodation, and it's a field that, in my view, it's understudied, especially, for example, the use of fiscal instruments to accommodate diversity, to reduce the risk of secession. This is something that has barely been explored. It has been explored to a certain extent, for example, in Canada by André Lecour and Daniel Belin, but not in other realities. So I think this is something that needs to be further explored, and something that, by the way, we tried to do a couple of weeks ago in a conference we had here at the Institute of Comparative Federalism. Third, about the symbolic politics story, which actually gives the title to the book. I think this is something that we clearly see in the cover. I think that, especially if we have the book here, in the cover here, we see these apparently two young men looking in opposite directions, each one carrying a flag that is, of course, a symbol that symbolizes the adherence to a group that I would define as mutually exclusive, because in a way they are denying this notion of dual identities. And furthermore, to put it into context, I think that it deserves to be highlighted that the estelada that we see on the left-hand side, it's not the official flag the official flag of Catalonia. And even though the institutions of that community have been in the hands of pro-secessionist parties during the last years, there needed to be something new, something symbolic, something that would give birth to this new political reality, to this new state, to this new Catalan independent state. We don't know if a multinational state or not, probably not. Everything points to a unitary nation state, but here we see clearly the importance of symbols to rally people around a common idea of a new state. And this is something that, for example, we have seen also in Yugoslavia, the importance of symbols to define the national communities. And the final consideration that I would like to make about the theoretical framework of the book, it's about the structure of the cases, because I think this structure perfectly illustrates the dynamic nature of contestatory federalism, of how the federal system tries to achieve a new equilibrium after giving an answer to the demands of the minority nation, and how this minority nation reacts with new demands. And actually, I think this can lead us to wonder if it is possible to find an endurable equilibrium, or if we are just witnessing somehow a process that irremediably leads in the long run to secession, because accommodation, or maybe better said, the institutionalization of the difference, does not counter but rewards and stimulates secessionism, all in the end leading to a never-ending process, a spiral of demands of recognition, reaction, new demands, reaction again, maybe further recognition, etc., etc. So this is something I know that Carlo has worked on this before, and maybe I would like to hear a bit more on this. And now delving on the cases, I will just make 3-4 comments about the cases, because I don't want to go over time. And first, regarding Canada and Quebec, here I would argue that the majority backlash was maybe a hiccup, a peak of tension that led to the secessionist crisis of 1995, but that has not reemerged. And in fact, I would, as Chantal Hébert, a Canadian political commentator, wrote once, Mitch Lake foes won the battle, but lost the war. Because with the governments of Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, and especially, and then Stephen Harper, we saw, on the one hand, new gains for Quebec on the political economy side, especially during the Harper era, reduction in the federal spending power in line with this neoliberal ideology, this approach of the watertight compartments that was so much appreciated by the old members of the Reform Party. But on the other hand, we also saw that this era included symbolic measures, such as the participation of Quebec in UNESCO, of course, more importantly, the recognition by the House of Commons that the Quebecois form a nation with a united Canada. And in the end, in my view, this was the start of a process where Quebec has somehow achieved most of the Mitch-Lake demands, such as those on immigration, and for example, more recently, under the government of Justin Trudeau, the selection of judges for the Quebec Appeal Court and those 3 judges coming from the civil law system of the Supreme Court. And in fact, I think it should come, this of course, support the argument of the book, and it should come as no surprise that in a poll that was released, I think, at the beginning of the week, support for secession is polling at practically at the minimum, despite the government of Quebec of François Legault polling in probably in one of the highest levels of support in the coming election in October, and also with the Parti Québécois, the traditional house of sovereignism in Quebec, with a forecast of just 1 seat in the election in October. So probably the success of the new government of Quebec, of the actual government of Quebec, it's combining this political economy side on the one hand and the symbolic politics on the other, especially with these 2 new laws regarding the banning of religious symbols in public places, and also the amendments to the Charter of the French language. Going to the case of Spain and Catalonia, here I would make 2 comments. The first one is that I think that the majority backlash was also present in the first round, although probably in a more nuanced and not that far-reaching form. But in my view, the accession of Andalusia to full autonomy following the procedure of Article 151 of the Spanish Constitution was a reaction towards the fast-track access to autonomy that was granted to the Basque Country, Catalonia, and Galicia. And in fact, I think that this process represented a logic that has been deeply rooted in the Spanish territorial system, a widespread notion of the impossibility of territorial privileges, and probably this also extends to symbolism somehow. Of course, beside those that are enshrined in the Constitution regarding the fiscal special arrangements for the Basque Country and Navarra. And also, in this sense, the book mentions the Declaration of Barcelona by the nationalist forces of Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia, claiming for more symbolic recognition. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe I am, so please, Carlo, correct me if I am. I think the book does not mention that this declaration was echoed. There was a clear majority backlash by the Declaration of Mérida, where the leaders of Andalusia, Extremadura, and Castilla-La Mancha, all socialist governments, by the way, at the time, they also signed a declaration as a reaction, and I quote, all the autonomous communities have the right to access the level of autonomy that they so desire within the Constitution, and that privileges or inequality between Spaniards cannot be tolerated. So clear a reaction again. I would not say against symbolism, against the notion that symbolism would lead to concessions on the political economy side, to economic privileges. And this is something that, of course, these 3 autonomous communities that are they are lagging behind in economic terms with the rest of the country. So probably the reaction was to, and this is something that I think is deeply rooted in Spanish politics, the reaction about something that could be interpreted as a privilege in economic terms for the autonomous communities with nationalist government, mainly Catalonia, and also to a certain extent the Basque Country. Also, in relation to Spain, I would say that as for the reversal of the concessions in the 2010 ruling of the Constitutional Court, although some may be questionable, and maybe this is the constitutional lawyer within me talking, there were some provisions of the Statute of Autonomy that were clearly designed to be unconstitutional, that were clearly designed to clash with the central executive or to try to make a point, but they were not, their place was not the Statute of Autonomy, was probably a reform of the Constitution. But however, despite the contestation and the backlash towards some of the provisions of the Catalan Statute of 2006, this was actually the model to follow for the so-called second generation Statute of Autonomy. And in fact, the Statute of Autonomy of Andalusia that was approved both by the People's Party that took the Catalan Statute to the Constitutional Court and by the Socialists, copied, for example, the preamble, the declaration that Andalusia is a national reality, which nobody really knows what it means, but it was not challenged in court. Or, for example, the configuration of the judicial branch, which has never been put into place because it's unconstitutional, because it was declared as such by the Constitutional Court in the case of Catalonia. But here there was no contestation, there was not perceived risk of a minority clashing with the majority. And in fact, the Catalan Statute of Autonomy led to some other autonomous communities, especially Valencia and I think then Aragon, to introducing this clause that any power that was transferred to another autonomous community, everybody thinking about Catalonia, of course, must be also available to them. So in the end, the majority backlash was also kind of, I don't know how to describe it, like a fast track to a higher level of autonomy. So in the end, Catalonia was, of course, the first mover, but then the others were quickly trying to this catch-up effect. I will move to Czechoslovakia. I won't mention the Basque Country. Probably will go back during the Q&A. And in the case of Czechoslovakia, this was very interesting for me to read, especially when you describe that Dubček federalist reform survived the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. And I was wondering, it's maybe a bit provocative, but maybe it was not just socialism with a human face, but also federalism with a human face. So, but however, the most striking aspect, I would say, in the case of Czechoslovakia was that symbolic recognition was not the biggest issue, with the exception of the state treaty you mentioned before, but the economic factors, of course, probably because of Slovakia lagging behind the difficulties of the transition towards a market economy and the highest dependence of Slovakia on the Soviet Union. But the result, it was also very interesting because in contrast with the other cases or the other crises, I would say, here is not the minority who pushes for secession, but it's just the majority who simply at some point they give up. And I was wondering if maybe the majority backlash is not precisely that. It's not precisely that giving up on the Union because they were not willing to stay united under conditions that were acceptable for the Slovakians. And finally, just to conclude, I will just allude to your last chapter, which is entitled "The Limits and Possibilities of Generalization." And in particular, I was thinking about the case of the UK, because when I read it, I had this idea popping in my mind, which I don't know, because maybe round one could be the initial process of devolution until the referendum, or maybe even also including the Devomax that followed the referendum. Maybe this can be seen also as a round one effect. But I wonder, when I read it, how does Brexit fit into this narrative? It is possible that Brexit can be seen by the Scots as somehow a majority backlash, in the sense that the EU posed a threat to the British or maybe English idea of a single strong state. Of course, Brexit was not a reaction towards the transfer of powers to Scotland, but in my view, at least, the implementation of Brexit by the Conservative government of Boris Johnson, in practice, it has led to a certain extent to somehow a re-centralization of some competencies. For example, if we think of agriculture, fisheries, the internal economic union. So, in addition, so this can be seen maybe as a threat to Scottish self-government. And additionally, the refusal of Boris Johnson to a second referendum could also be an example of a majority backlash. And I think this is clearly going to be the symbolic factor that is going to be used by Nicola Sturgeon. And this is something that even the former Conservative Prime Minister John Major warned the Conservative Party some time ago. So I also would like to, if you could delve a bit more on this issue. And I will stop myself because I think I probably have gone over time a bit. So
no, it's fine. Thanks, Francisco. I remind participants that questions can be asked in the Q&A section below. So far, I haven't seen any, but I think there are many open questions in the air. Oh, there is one. Okay, should I read it out for you, or you can see it, right?
Carlo? Oh, in the chat, yeah?
In the Q&A, yeah.
Okay.
So Francisco Palermo is thanking for the presentation and interesting discussion. He writes, I agree with Maya that a key point of the book is that you consider the impact on majority communities too, in order to consider the whole of society when addressing minority claims. When it comes to shared symbols, however, multinational states normally fail and rather promote the symbols of each community, despite the calls for shared symbols and societies by international standards, including, for example, the High Commissioner on National Minorities, Ljubljana guidelines. My question is not why this is the case, the answer is pretty intuitive, but rather, is the establishment of common, albeit artificial symbolism helpful or not, under which conditions?
Let me just close this. So this is, by the way, first of all, I just wanted to thank Francisco, Javier, and Maya. This is really remarkable. This was the right choice, is what I'm trying to say, of venue and people to bring in. Francisco, thank you. Francesco, sorry, thank you for the question. I think this is a critical kind of policy relevant question. And because it touches on the policy implications of the book, right? Does it actually make sense to build common a repertoire of common symbols in the context of a multinational state? And I think the answer is, what kinds of symbols are you cobbling together? But that's going to depend, I think, on the point in kind of the historical evolution of a particular state. And I think particularly for minority nationalists, any kind of symbols that do not incorporate the national pluralism are rejected as joint symbols, right? Which to me is something, in fact, I'm wondering if I should actually share, let me just do this. Can you see this? Yeah, okay. So, sorry about this. This was my favorite one, right? So this is the one for, just put this down. This is the Croatian leader, Savka Dabčević-Kučar, in 1970. So she doesn't talk about symbols here necessarily, right? But you can see the implications of what she's saying. She's basically saying that there is no single Yugoslav people, right? And I mean, this is the clearest articulation that I've seen of a kind of notion that every single aspect of the formal organization of a multinational state, even if you're talking about things like joint institutions or even joint symbols, has to reflect the notion that there is no single people, right? And so I wonder if we were to be able to transpose ourselves into 1970 and in this, during her speech to say, well, what if we wanted to combine the multinationalism with a kind of joint understanding that there is something more, that we as Yugoslav peoples are more than the sum of our parts? I think the response would have been, well, no, right? The only thing that there is ultimately is that. But a lot, I think, would depend on the kinds of discourses at a particular juncture in time and whether or not you could. My point is, I think I'm actually rambling, but I think my point is that if you have a sort of radicalization of the discourse, and if a substantial proportion of the minority population buys into this and becomes hypersensitive to any attempt to articulate something that is national, right? That that this is dangerous in effect, right? I mean, this is something that the UK government has been trying to do, kind of relabel things, trying to emphasize UK-wide identities. But given the point in which we find ourselves in the Union here in the UK, I think that's either does not do anything, right? Because there's sufficient number of Scots or Welsh people who are already convinced Unionists, or if anything, actually antagonizes the people who are suspicious of any of those kinds of activities. I hope that helps as an answer.
Okay, we have 2 more questions in our chat. I read them out for the video, so we have them on tape also. This is a great contribution by Carlo, and it's Jonathan Fessa writing. Thanks for the wonderful discussion. Can Carlo say more on the distinction he makes between institutions and symbols? I'm asking because because that distinction may sometimes not be there or blurred. Think of language policy. On the one hand, this is about the institutional regulation of the use of language. On the other hand, language policy says a lot about how the state defines itself. Thanks. Then there's another one. Should I read it out?
Can we go one by one if you don't mind? It's just easier. It makes it more conversational. Sure. So, Jonathan, thank you very much. I think this is a question that I've been struggling with as I was developing the ideas in the book, and I agree that there's probably very little out there in the political world that cannot be turned into a potent political symbol, right? So I think language policy is absolutely what you say it is, right? So language policy is both instrumental and symbolic. It's instrumental because it allows you to protect, a particular community's language, but it's also symbolic because it's a recognition of the community's status. My answer to that is that I think that there's a hierarchy of both the appealability of certain kinds of aspects of social reality and their potency. And I think the organization of the state itself is sort of a meta symbol, right? And this is something that Francisco Javier's questions were alluding to in terms of, and comments in terms of, this kind of backlash by other communities, where basically what they're saying is, sure, you can have what you want, but it has to be generalized everywhere. And that's a symbolic argument, right? Because it considers it concerns the overall organization of the state. And I think the state as such is such a potent part of political modernity, such a potent symbol of political modernity, that I think it's actually this meta symbol that is more likely to actually be able to. It's more mobilizable in a sense for political purposes, right? So for instance, I think you could try to mobilize a population around a particular fiscal distribution formula, but people don't go out in the streets demonstrating and protesting over fiscal distribution formulas, in part because these are complex and their implications are difficult, in part because they are just not as easy to symbolize or turn into a potent political symbol as, when somebody tells you, well, you're not a member of a nation, or your community is not a nation, right? It's these kinds of aspects of that particular reality, I think. I hope that answers the question. But it's a great question. It's very relevant, absolutely.
Thanks, Carlo. And then there's another one by Carl Kressner. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation, Carlo. Sorry for the long question, but the book is just too thought-provoking, and I think all the questions just confirm that. My question is related to how you define secessionist crisis, and as a consequence can assess whether there was one or not. You said regarding Czechoslovakia that there was no such crisis because, as is well known, the breakup was essentially a pact between two, to put it mildly, very ambitious politicians. So it was an elite thing and something actually opposed by both of the two populations. There's quite reliable survey data on that. Therefore, population, not elite, support seems to be element one for your definition of secessionist crisis. But once the support by whom is clear, another question is the support of what, and this appears to be element two of the definition. The question continues in Carl's second comment. Concerning Quebec, you said that the push for sovereignty association in 1980 would rather not be sufficient to qualify as a secessionist crisis. But where is the threshold then, especially as many secessionist claims have some association element? So to sum up, how do you operationalize these two elements, and are there others?
Sorry, thank you, Carl. I'm always uncomfortable with these kinds of exercises in political science, which is, in order to make something comparable, you need to come up with what might be a fairly arbitrary definition, right? Which is why I basically put two elements here. The first element is, you're right, it's popular. It's the popular support, the level of popular support. The second element is whether or not the political leadership of the particular region actually acts on that support, right? So you don't have a political crisis, even if you have 60% of the population in favor of secession, if the political leadership basically ignores the quote unquote will of the people and does nothing, in that context. So close to or above 50% of the support of the population is, again, arguably arbitrary, but I think it's the best approximation of what people intuitively would consider to be a sort of threshold criterion for having a sort of massive kind of upsurge, sufficient that it actually threatens the territorial integrity of the state. It's not a satisfactory answer. I'm not happy with it. But anything else that I would try would probably be equally arbitrary and probably would become too complex to be kind of analytically useful, I think. But I'm willing to be persuaded otherwise. So hopefully when I come over there, you'll be there and we can have a beer and talk about it.
I'm afraid Carl is in Canada right now, so
Oh,
you'll not be able
all
to
right.
meet him
Virtual
at
beer
Pyrrhic
then.
Research. But yeah, I think there are a lot more opportunities to exchange. We have another question by John van der Weert. In the case of Russia and the historical project of Russianness, Putin has routinely espoused that ethnicity is not important so long as the endorsement of a single Russian cultural identity is supported. My question is that on the surface, the erasure of ethnic divisions in the pursuit of national homogeneity is pernicious, yet there is a tinge of attractiveness to the idea of reducing ethnic division for the sake of a singular national ideal. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, a tough question. I frankly, if you're asking me what my normative stance on this is, it's basically I don't want to tell anybody who they are and what they are, right? And I think that sort of implicitly comes through in the book. Full disclosure, when I was growing up in Yugoslavia, I felt that Yugoslavia and the context in which I grew up was one in which the country was increasingly riven along, not ethno-national, I would say, or nationalist aligning with ethnicity kind of lines. And I was, of course, not comfortable with that. But over the course of my research and some kind of self-searching, came to the position where I kind of realized the power of those kind of national, whether you want to kind of call them ethno-national distinctions or otherwise, but those distinctions. So I don't really. I think any deliberate attempt to, and it kind of links to Francesco's question, any deliberate attempt to kind of engineer a common national identity that implies forcing people into specific identities, I just can't get behind. Any attempt to, so in other words, assimilation in a national sense, right? Any attempt that might have how should I put this? Let's say structural changes to policies that might potentially result in the creation of common identity. So these are the integrationist measures sometimes suggested, right? So why not have a federation that is non-ethnic? Why not have particular kinds of electoral systems that foster the activation of cross-cutting cleavages, things of that nature? The problem with that is that anytime one tries for those kinds of policies, there are going to be people who insist on their more particularist identity, who are going to recognize it for what it is. So my position is, if you want to create a joint identity or some sort of extra layer of identity in a multinational state, probably the best way to get that done is not to deliberately try to devise a policy around that, but to try to foster nationalist indifference, so that a generation or two generations can pass, so that those very, very what are, let's say today, very, very sharply defined nationalist distinctions could simply ebb away. So I would say national indifference rather than deliberate policies. That's sort of where I stand. I hope that answers the question, but again, I'm not entirely sure. I'm never sure entirely of most things that I say.
Very good. Do you want to give some feedback on the comments of Maya and Francisco Javier?
I do. I think there's tons here, so I can't do them all justice. Let me just take one. Maya, thank you so much for the comments and for the questions. There was a question about the basically the role of processes, if I understood you right, rather than just institutions themselves. And I think you're right, but I think the two, it's difficult to kind of disentangle the two. And again, a lot depends on the kind of stage at which you find yourself. So if you are in what Zartman calls mutually hurting stalemate, you have a civil war, people are exhausted, et cetera, there might be some appetite for giving up on very sharply defined institutions. You park those for the time being, you focus on certain kinds of disaggregated processes. Neophytos Loizides, I'm not sure if you know his work, he's done some really, really cool, interesting stuff, he and his team, where they basically come up, and he's done it, by the way, on Bosnia, on Northern Ireland, and on Cyprus. So different articles where they try to kind of offer up a menu of different, I mean, these are institutional choices again, but you could see how it could be converted maybe into a process. to see what the common grounds might be between, let's say, the Greek and Turkish Cypriots, or between Bosniaks or Bosnians and Croats and Serbs in Bosnia, or unionist versus nationalist in Northern Ireland. So it's really, really cool. It's really interesting because it speaks precisely to this. Is there somewhere where you can kind of shave off all the kind of massive kind of institutional, heavily symbolically laden kind of elements of these situations, and kind of focus on things that are a little more, bread and butter kinds of things, right? So yeah, I think that's very, very important. Look, I want to join the fluidity of boundaries and borders and the notion of political parties and their role. I want to join them. I think the book, as I originally wrote it, was probably about at least a third longer than it ended up being. So I shaved about probably 60 or 70 pages. And the reason was because I wanted to read as a pamphlet, so that whole thing about the role of this kind of symbolic institutionalism would come through more clearly. But I understood that was going to mean that I couldn't just put as much really interesting stuff there, including, for example, the idea that these identities are fluid, that these processes basically make them come apart and congeal over time, right? So you can have people who are quite indifferent, then they become far more invested, then it falls off maybe 10, 15 years later, et cetera, right? So in a way, I wish that I could have written a longer book, but then I wonder if it would have been as potable, as you said, but I take the point. And then there's that tension between this notion of generalizability of the whole thing and context, right? So I'm not saying we don't need a general theory of multinational state. I think what I'm saying is that we can't have a general theory of multinational state. And when I say theory, I mean more in the sense of what I presented, right? Like these specific steps lead to those specific outcomes, right? So, but nevertheless, what I am saying overall, which is a broader kind of, I guess, ontological point, is there is something that unites these multinational states. And that's that kind of conditional legitimacy, which goes to the point of crises, right? Which is that, this is something normal for a multinational state. And I think in the conclusion, I try to see where else this has kind of popped up. And I find that indeed, it does pop up in Sri Lanka. It does pop up in Cyprus. It does pop up in other places. I wish that I knew. I was just at a workshop recently. I wish I knew more about Ethiopia, for example, and I'm gonna know more about Ethiopia, hopefully over the course of the year. But there's it matters. I'm just not sure if it matters in the same way and through the same processes. And I think one of the reasons is probably, if you have a context of a civil war, things are going to be a little different, right? Or post-civil war situation than if you have a kind of peacetime context. But I also, and this is something that I keep emphasizing, there is something about state meaning. The state as such cannot mean the same thing for an Austrian person in the present, or somebody, an indigenous person in Bolivia, or somebody living in the countryside, let's say in certain parts of India. And we don't have empirical evidence of that, but bits and pieces that I've been able to draw on lead me to believe that the state means something very different, right? Not just a specific state, but the state as such. And that's why I'm skeptical of the possibility of fully generalizable theory. Francisco, Javier, look, there's so much really, really cool stuff here. I think Andalusia as a backlash, as the original backlash, this is brilliant. This is really good. I mean, obviously I'm familiar with it. But I think also, and then of course the Declaration of Merida. That Declaration of Merida, and then all of those, the copying of the Catalan model, all of those things kind of seem to dovetail with the argument that I'm making, because all of them seem to lend themselves to this understanding: no, you cannot have asymmetry. And because asymmetry is such a potent, the formal asymmetry, because informally, who cares, right? But formal asymmetry has to be there. I think it's basically a continuation. So I think we could let's say co-author a piece in which we're saying, well, this is more complicated, but it basically is a very similar story. I think, but again, open to, and when you come to Edinburgh, we can talk about this more, because you and I can actually have a do. Let me see. Symbolic domain, survival. I did want to emphasize something in the Czechoslovak case. You're right in pointing out that the symbolic stuff did not matter, but note what's happened there. Despite real economic pain in Slovakia, right, and that real economic pain manifested itself in demands for greater control over fiscal policy, over monetary policy, for example. They wanted their own monetary policy. Despite real material pain for the population in Slovakia, the support for independence was low, which to me is actually a very, very potent, very, very important bit of evidence for the argument that I'm making here, right? And I wonder how it would have been had there been some sort of, majority backlash to the very recognition of Slovak nationhood. And my hunch is that probably it would have been a different kind of outcome, right? That it would have been probably more conflictual. Brilliant about UK. I agree with you. I think round one, the kind of devolution, late 19th into the next kind of the decade or so is probably round one. This is the way in which I've been thinking about it. I think what's remarkable about Brexit is that it is a form of majority nationalism. But what's remarkable, and that's typical of the UK's exceptionalism, and I do say this deliberately, is that instead of being turned inwards, it was turned outwards. In all of the other multinational states that I know about, the backlash has been turned inwards, right, toward a reconstitution of the state itself. I believe if there was appetite in the UK right now to engage in some sort of far-reaching constitutional change, that would force the English to change the way in which they think of themselves in the name of accommodating Scots, Welsh, or Irish, I think then we would have internal backlash. But I'm not entirely, I'm quite certain that the London-centered political elites are very, very unlikely to engage in any sort of far-reaching federalizing reforms, which I think would probably be necessary in order to place the UK on more sustainable constitutional and political grounds. So there's more that I could say, but I think this is basically, it takes us close to the end.
Thank you very much. Maya, Francisco, Javier, are you fine with that? Do you have more comments?
I think I have to be fine with that.
Same.
Me too. Thank you.
Very good. So we're almost on time. Thank you very much, Carlo, Maya, and Francisco Javier. Thank you all for the wonderful discussion, for the numerous questions. And congratulations, Carlo, for this great book, which I think is worth presenting even a 12th or a 13th or 14th time. So we had a similar number of webinars, like 11 or probably a bit more in the last weeks. And this is the last one before the summer break. So I'd like to take this opportunity to give special thanks to our meeting management at Europe Research, Ivan, Irina, Anna, Alexa, Stefan. They're doing a tremendous job, and they have a lot of patience behind the scenes, and it's not seen. So as I said, our webinars are now taking a summer break. We'll be back in autumn, and in the meantime, you can watch all our videos on our YouTube channel. Just type in Europe Federalism and you'll find them. Okay, once again, thanks a lot. I hope to see you in autumn. And Carlo, have a nice time at Europe Research very soon.
Thank you very much for this. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for fantastic questions and for hosting. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you, Petra, for everything.
Thank you all.